From here I can take the existing look from my original, which I'll duplicate and move out, and we'll call this final, and go into that comp. And basically I want to replace everything that's in here. So I'm going to select the camera, hold shift and go all the way down to the last text layer and delete. And then I'm just going to copy and paste all of these layers. So starting with the camera controller, scrolling down, holding shift and clicking on the last text layer, copy, Command or Control C, and paste right above this layer right here, Command or Control V. And now my animation has been transferred over. Now obviously the colors are wrong, so let me grab those really quickly. Again, going back into that final, I can just grab the color of any one of these text layers, copy, and then apply that to all of the text layers in this comp. So I'll select everything, paste that color value, and then these are shape layers for that text, so I need to make sure I paste it in there as well. And then finally I have a pre-comp for this last block of text, so I need to make sure that my fill for that is set to the right color. And now my updated camera movement has been inserted into this style that I had already created. Now again, I'm not going to walk you through how I created this step by step because that's not really what this class is about, but I do want to show you one thing that I did in this comp, which is this layer down here called Form. Form is a plugin from a company called Trapcode, and it's a particle generator. What it lets you do is basically create a grid of particles that you can style in lots of different ways. It's a really great way of making things like clouds or mist, general atmosphere, but you can push it way further than that and do a lot of really complex things with it. All I'm using it for here is the little dust particles that are in the background. So these little spheres, these dots that are kind of floating around in my environment. And these are 3D enabled. That's why we have the 3D icon right here. But that means it's going to respond to my camera movement. If I solo this layer out and turn the background off, you can kind of see these dots. They're really small. If I go into my particle settings and turn the size up quite a bit, then they're much more apparent what's going on. And if I just scrub through, you can see that the camera movement is revealing that these are actually existing in 3D space. Now again, this is an effect applied to a 2D layer, so it's going to render on top or below of whatever it is on top of or below in the layer stack. But because they're just tiny little particles, these dust particles, it doesn't really make that big of a difference. So let me undo back to where they were nice and small and in the environment. But that's a really easy way to add a little bit of atmosphere and a little bit more sense of space in your 3D compositions. Everything else was just stylizing it a little bit. We already talked about the texture that I added using the turbulent noise, and then the effect stack of blurring, sharpening, and then adding some grain, and then I have a vignette. The background is just a gradient from this light color to a little bit darker shade of it to give the background a little bit of a sense of lighting, like there's a light source up on this side. But that's all the steps that I took to stylize this comp a little bit. Now, like I said, if you're doing a lyric video, feel free to do the entire song and feel free to push your design as far as you want. Or as little as you want. Honestly, you could just have blocks of text that are not animated, and I won't mind at all. Really, what I just want to see is that you have a good sense for how to place objects in 3D space, working with the 3D environment in After Effects, and being able to smoothly animate your camera around those objects in that 3D space. It doesn't matter to me how you're animating the camera. If anything in your scene is actually animated, or if there are any other design elements, I just want to see that you know how to navigate around this 3D space and actually move your camera around. Be as complex or as simple as you'd like. Now, another really great part of After Effects and motion graphics in general is the ability to add motion blur, which is another one of those real-world phenomenons, whether you're looking through a camera or even your own eyes. Things that move fast are blurry. And with the camera, you can really control how much motion blur there is based on the shutter speed of the camera. In After Effects, you can do the exact same thing, and it can add a lot of realism and emphasis to your motion. Now, I don't have any currently enabled in this lyric video. If I go to some place where the camera's moving kind of fast, and let me turn off the effects and things just so this renders a little quicker. So let's say right about here, when the camera's really moving through this text at a pretty decent speed, there's no motion blur. This is nice, crisp, clean from one frame to the next. But if I come over to my Layers palette and take a look at these switches, right here is the 3D column, but this little icon right here with the ball and the trail, that is the motion blur. So I want to select all of those layers that make up my comp and all the lyrics and enable the motion blur switch on them. Now that that's done, instantly my comp has this blurriness on top of this text. And this is what motion blur is. So let's just back up a little bit and play this section, this little transition from here to here. You can see it's going to take more time to render. For one, I have the form layer in the background, so it's got to calculate that. But motion blur does add render time because it's basically making a bunch of copies of what you're seeing and merging them all together in this nice blend to generate that motion blur. Let's play this back. Okay, so like I said, it is subtle. It can easily be overlooked, but that's partially because your brain is used to seeing this motion blur on things that are moving fast. So it can really add a lot of realism to your movement. Again, if we turn this off and play it back, it doesn't necessarily look bad, but that blur really sells the fact that you're moving quickly. And like I said, you can shape the way that this motion blur looks. So if I go into my composition settings, composition settings, then go into the advanced tab, this is where you have a motion blur category. So if I move this out of the way, I have preview checked, so modifying these properties will update the way that the motion blur looks. Currently my shutter angle is set to 90 degrees. It doesn't matter if you don't know what that means, but I've actually modified this from the default. Yours is probably set to 180. So let's change that, and when I apply this, just watch some of the blur right here and see what happens. See, it really blurred out a lot more. So basically think about the shutter angle as the higher the number, the more motion blur, the longer the motion blur trails are going to be. And the smaller the number, 90 degrees, was much tighter. Or if you drop this down to 45, then it's going to be even less noticeable. 360 would be a crazy amount of motion blur, and you can see all the individual samples. It doesn't look that great. For this particular piece, I wanted it set to 90 because I thought that was a pretty realistic looking amount of motion blur. But next I want to move down to this samples per frame section. This is the number of individual samples that make up the motion blur. If I turn this really down low to say 4, then you're going to see each one of those individual samples. And this is how you can really understand how the motion blur is being calculated. It's basically taking where this text would move a certain distance based on your shutter angle, and then duplicating and lowering the opacity of each individual copy. So since there are only 4 samples, we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 would be the original sample. So you need to turn this up until you can't really see those samples anymore. 16 is going to do it just fine for this one, but if you had a shutter angle of 180, those samples start to come back. You might need to push this up to 24. Or even 36, and as you do this, the render times take longer and longer. So a lot of the time, I'll disable my motion blur for my comp while I'm working just so it renders more quickly, and then re-enable it on the final look over to make sure everything is working fine. But I'm going to turn this back down to 90 and 16, and then click OK. There's a really quick way to disable all of the motion blur for the comp, and that's this icon right here. If I just click that off, no more motion blur, things will render more quickly. So be aware of that. But that's how you can implement motion blur into your animations. Another way to add realism to your animations, specifically your 3D cameras, is adding in camera shake. Because that's a natural thing to happen if you have a handheld camera. There's going to be a little bit of camera shake. And we can fake this using just some very basic expressions. And the way that I'm going to do it with my camera setup, since I have a camera controller, is applying a little bit of wiggle or shake to my actual camera, not the camera controller. Remember, because this is parented to the null object, I can move it around independently of the null object, and this way I'm going to preserve all the animation I put on the camera controller. So what I basically want to do is wiggle the orientation of my camera just a little bit and possibly some of the position. But let's start with the orientation. So with the camera selected, I'll press R to bring up the rotation, and instead of applying the expression to just the orientation, I'm going to make 3 different expressions for the X, Y, and Z rotation. And the reason I'm doing this is just so I don't have to add in more complex expressions to target each one of these values within a single property. Let's start with just the X rotation. So if I move this around, you can see it's moving the camera up and down. I'm going to disable my motion blur just so this renders a little bit more quickly. Yeah, that's much better. Okay, and I'm going to add an expression to this property by holding down Option or Alt on a PC and clicking on the X rotation. Don't worry if you don't understand expressions. Just follow along. I'll explain everything that I'm doing, and by the end of this process, you'll have a nice little camera shake rig. We're going to be using the wiggle expression to randomly adjust this property in a given range. So to start, I'm just going to type out wiggle, and After Effects is even going to give me a little bit of an autofill, and I'm just going to double click on that, and that will give me the rest of this expression. See, it made parentheses for me to type in. So this is where I need to put some numbers. The way the wiggle expression works is you're saying wiggle this property, and then we need two numbers separated by a comma. The first number is going to be the frequency, or how many times per second this wiggle should happen randomly. So let's just say something like 3 times a second. So wiggle 3 times a second, and then we need to put a comma and give it another value. This second value is the amplitude, or basically how much is the maximum that we want After Effects to change this value. And this is going to be measured in the units of whatever you're applying it to. So degrees, let's say 5 degrees. It doesn't take a lot of wiggling to get camera shake to show up on rotation values for the camera. So that's all we need to do. So one more time, this is saying wiggle the X rotation 3 times a second by an amount of 5 pixels, either positive or negative. Just to follow proper syntax, I'm going to add a semicolon at the end of that line and then click out of it. And let's play this to see what happens. You can call me. And actually, I'm just going to mute my audio real quick and play that back. Alright, so you can see that the camera is now shaking up and down basically. The tilt of the camera is moving on that x-axis 3 times a second by a maximum of 5 degrees in either direction. And this is obviously way too much. We don't want this wiggly wobbly camera shake. So let's modify maybe the amplitude, the second value here. And instead of 5 degrees, let's say 2 degrees. So it's going to be a maximum of 2 degrees off of the neutral value of 0, either positive or negative. Okay, so now the shaking is much more subtle. It might still be too much, honestly, but for now, let's call that good and move on to the next property. Now, I want to basically do the same thing on the Y rotation, so I'm just going to right-click on X rotation, say Copy Expression Only, then select the Y rotation and paste, Command or Control V. Twirl this down so we can see that we have the same exact expression and play this back again. So now not only are we wiggling up and down, we're also wiggling left and right. And we're getting a little wiggly wobbly again. It's probably too much, but let's just move on to the Z rotation so we have wiggle on all 3 axes, and then we'll start manipulating these numbers. So I'll just select that Z rotation and paste again, twirl that down, and then preview this one more time. Alright, so now it's like our camera operator is drunk. He cannot keep his hands still. It's way too crazy. But now that we're here, we can start dialing in these numbers. So definitely on the Z-axis, where it's rotating like a clock on the clockwise or counterclockwise motion, that needs to move a lot less. So instead of 2 degrees, I'm going to just put this down to 0.5. So it's just a ½ degree wiggle rotation on that Z-axis. And then on the Y-axis and even probably the X-axis, I'm going to drop these down to 1 because I want this camera shake to be very subtle. Enough for you to notice it, but not enough for you to feel super dizzy and wobbly. So it's a lot more subtle now, and I think it's looking better, but we can also lower the frequency of some of these. So maybe on the Z-axis, instead of 3 times per second, it wiggles just 1 time per second. And maybe the Y-axis, we wiggle, I don't know, 2.3 times per second, just to get a little variation between the X and the Y. Now they're all wiggling at different frequencies on each axis, and the Z-axis has a different amplitude than the other 2 properties. So now we've created a much more subtle camera shake. It's still very noticeable, but a lot more subtle. Now, a much easier way to modify these numbers without having to go into each expression and change these numbers one at a time is to just add in some slider controls, which do nothing on their own. They're just empty effects that you can tie expressions to. Let me show you how to do that really quickly. Now, you can't actually apply effects to cameras. If I go up to my effect panel, you see nothing is there. So I'm just going to use the camera controller as a place to hold these expression controls, and we'll reference them from these expressions. So with my camera controller selected, I'll come up to Effect, down to Expression Controls, and then Slider Control. I'll click on that, and this is just going to give me an empty slider with a value between 0 and 100. I'm going to rename this effect by having it selected and press enter. And I'll call this X frequency and press enter again. And then I'm going to right click on the slider and say edit value. I don't need the maximum range to be 100. I'll just set this up to maybe 10. Honestly, that's probably way more than I need, but that way my range is much smaller as I move this slider around. Now that that's done, I'm going to duplicate this by pressing Command or Control D, and I'll call this Y frequency, and then I'll duplicate it one more time and call this Z frequency. Then I need a slider for the amplitude. Remember, the second value is amplitude. So I'm going to duplicate this again and call this X amplitude. Duplicate, call it Y amplitude, and then duplicate and call it Z amplitude. So now I have sliders for every one of these values in my expressions. So let's just transfer these numbers into the corresponding sliders. So the X rotations wiggle frequency, X frequency is 3. And I'll collapse this up, and the amplitude for the X is 1. The wiggle for Y is 2.3 on the frequency, 2.3, and 1 on the amplitude. And then we have 1 and 0.5 for the Z. So 1 on the frequency, 0.5 on the amplitude. Now that I have those same values all transferred over to these sliders, I can change my expressions to reference these sliders instead. To keep these active when I select the camera, I'm going to lock the Effects Controls panel just by clicking this little lock right here. Now I can go to any other layer, but these will stay visible. With that done, I'm going to go into my X rotation, and I want to select the frequency value, that first number, and then just grab my expression pick whip, click and drag all the way up to the X frequency, and let go. After Effects automatically plugs in all of the code that you need to reference that value, and then we can go to the second number right here after the comma, the amplitude, and reference the X amplitude. I'll click off of this, and I actually get an expression error. And the reason for that is because After Effects actually left off a parentheses at the very end of the expression. So I need to go just before that semicolon and add a second closing parentheses to close off that argument. So with that extra parentheses, I should be able to click off, and there we go. Now that's solved. Now this value is being wiggled based on the X frequency and the X amplitude values. So if I turn the amplitude up, you can see that's affecting how much the camera is wiggling at any given point. I'll undo that, and let's plug in the rest of these numbers. So again, the process is select the first value, the frequency. This is the Y rotation. So I'll grab that expression pick whip and go up to the Y frequency. After Effects fills in the code. Then I'll select that second value, the amplitude, go up to the Y amplitude, let go, and then just make sure that I add that extra parentheses at the end. I really don't know why After Effects is removing that last one, but it must just be some bug. Click off of that, and no errors, so I know that worked. Let's do the Z rotation. Just select that number, expression pick whip the Z frequency, select the second number, pick whip the Z amplitude, finish it off with the closing parentheses, and click off. Now the animation itself is no different because all of those values are exactly the same. But let's say that I don't like how much it's bobbing up and down, or how quickly it's bobbing up and down on that X axis. Well, I'm just going to change my X frequency from 3 down to say 1.8. And now without having to modify any code, my camera shake has been updated. This is also a really easy way to animate camera shake to be more or less intense. So if we didn't want camera shake until the camera started moving more, maybe right about here, then I can set keyframes to basically enable that and then disable it someplace else. So let's say that right about here is where I want the wiggle to kick in. I'll set keyframes on the X, Y, and Z amplitudes, and then press U to bring up my keyframes. So there are my keyframes for X, Y, and Z. And then I'll back up a little bit to about here. This is where I want it to start wiggling, and I'll set these values down to 0. So now it's going to animate the amplitude of each of these values from 0 up to whatever I want it to wiggle at. So the start of my animation has no wiggle. And then right here it starts to kick in. Now it's really subtle because our values are so low. So just to illustrate this a little bit better, I'm going to increase the amplitude of each of these, and we'll see what that does. It's still pretty subtle because the camera transitions off the text pretty quickly, but maybe we want it to continue wiggling until right about here. So I'll just copy these 3 keyframes, Command C, Command V, and then go forward in time and turn these values back down to 0. So let's play that section back. So there you go. That's how you can build a very simple camera shake rig. And you could do this on any property you want. It doesn't have to just be the rotation. You could also add some shake to the position. Maybe the camera is moving up and down and left and right a little bit as well. It's totally up to you, and you can create whatever kind of look that you want this way. But feel free to play around with this. Hopefully those expressions didn't scare you and you're excited to maybe try and add some camera shake into your own projects.